So in this section of the video, we'll be going through will be some seated poses. So far we've done all of the kind of standing and the turnaround of those different views and poses. Some foreshortening, some explorations on the mechanics of constructing the hands and feet. And now I want to go through some of the same thing here, just in terms of setting up some approach or process outline to deal with some of the foreshortening and difficulties that might come along with a seated pose. As you can expect, it won't be too different because we're still dealing with that same vocabulary of line, shape, perspective, form intersection, overlapping, all those things. It's just going to be a little bit more jumbled or a little bit more foreshortened, really. So here, let's go ahead and lay this one in. So I'm going to start with my basic ideas around gesture and try to find my rhythms. And if you'd prefer to start with something that's more shape-based at this stage, there's really no problem for that. Always find a way to kind of play around with using these gesture lines, even if they're a little bit different than how I would in a standing pose. And to be more explicit with that, what I'm doing here that's only a little bit different is when the figure was standing. So let's just do a little quick gesture side view here. So let's say this is a head. And remember, our basic gestural formula for the spine was cervical, thoracic. Here's a stretch that usually belongs on the front, lumbar, pelvis. So all I've done when there's more of a contraction or a flexion forward of the torso is I just switch these lines. So we could see that this to this, that thoracic to lumbar, I just move to the front and then make the back one big stretch line. And that's just so I can get a little bit closer to the idea of the rib cage folding forward or flexing forward on the pelvis. You could do something similar, or you keep it the same. Doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to keep that vocabulary consistent and then find ways to alter it to give me access to showing different views. So then we have this leg here. And the big difference would be from a gesture that is standing to something that is seated is that the weight-bearing leg will no longer be my primary goal when starting my gesture from head down to weight-bearing leg. So it'll be in this case, the pelvis, or it could be whatever else the figure might be seated on. Maybe somebody's kneeling or something like that. So here's this back leg, and then arm. I'm probably trying to move this leg up a little bit now that I double check my distance. Okay, so once I'm done here, then the normal course would be, where's my tilt? Tilt, tilt, and then I'll put some shapes in. Pelvis shape, ribcage shape. Using that tilt line as kind of my guide for the angle, and then kind of keeping a relatively clean looking ellipse. And then after this, connections. So here's my neck. I could probably drop that head a little bit more, but here what I'm focused on doing is trying to get this series of overlaps. So here's the rib cage that overlaps and wraps. So I'm trying to bring that around and in front. This is behind. That connects into the head with our form intersection idea. My head could actually be way, way down. And this is just, what am I doing if I have to adjust this? I'm just dropping a ball lower in front of that too, which was the neck. In a way, I think this can take some pressure off of having to draw a figure or just drawing these basic perspective volumes and arranging them in different ways. Kind of thinking of my center line now. This would be that thoracic, cervical thoracic. See that there we talked about the use of the center line in the turnaround videos and how that helps me to turnaround figure, and that helps me to manage the way in which my planes and boxes are rotating. This would become now the lumbar. So that's stretched. Here's my sacrum. And then if we look at some of the, let's put this here, maybe put a little just different layer just so that these lines don't compete. There you go. Now I want to add that scapula. So that's one of our primary discussions so far has been how do I build one form on another so that we know this has to adopt that surface of the rib cage here. So that's the intersection between this kind of triangular flattened box and then that larger parent shape of the rib cage. Just build a little triangle, but still trying to think of it as having this kind of lift. And then on the opposite side, that's pulling further away. So I want to move it here. So maybe it would be, let's say right about there. So here would be the flattened box going now this way or this direction. And then maybe that's moving forward at that angle. And I'm going to take this and foreshorten it, which just means I'm making the width a little bit more narrow, this distance, so that it feels as though it's going forward in space. And then just kind of, just from myself, really, just clean up these wraps and overlaps, just trying to see the form a little bit more cleaner. Could see how my steps in terms of staging my line just get more refined at every layer or every pass, try to make it a little bit cleaner. And now into the landmarks of the pelvis and rib cage, see if we can find some boxes here. So for the rib cage, it was the floating rib. And then I'm going to bring that up with the tilt. And just maybe to the top of the scapula here. So that goes this way. That's my height and width. So I always start with this kind of back plane or front plane. And then from the distance from this point to the front of the egg is where I build my depth. So hopefully not to your great disappointment, there's no real difference in drawing a seated view. You're just maybe having to understand or see a perspective from a slightly different angle or understand the figure from a slightly different angle. But I don't think that the steps ever really need to be adjusted unless there's something that's severely foreshortened. But that's what I'm always looking for, is how can I approach with one constant or kind of reliable process, a way to understand most every view. And then we could do the same thing here for that pelvis. So I'm looking to set 3 lines up as a further description of that ball or egg of the pelvis. So the egg establishes, the proportion, the tilt, and now I'm just going to dice it up. That's the width. Here's the depth. And this is the height. So the big difference, so the only difference, the only fundamental difference here would be that from the back view, we used to say, or my rule has been, let's put it over here, I'm always going to be under the pelvis and over the rib cage. But I've just shifted that to make it feel as though it's more impacted by the ground. Those aren't very pretty boxes, but you get the point. So once I have my 3, then I just copy them by parallel. So every height goes the same direction, every depth, every width. For our pinch and stretch here, kind of skip that, but I'd say this is maybe more of a pinch. But really all I do in this area, if you, let's say you kind of do what I did and you missed it and you're going to come back and address it now, I'm just building what I want to look like a soft tissue intersection that still describes this plane bridging this plane. So here I'm just kind of building like a molding that feels softer relative to the boxes. So it's just the curve C or S as we discussed it. And then, but making this kind of soft tissue plane that will always bridge the side of the rib cage and the side of the pelvis. So that might be an even easier or hopefully a more practical way to think of how that intersection, if the C and the S in prior explanations just kind of didn't land. So that would be kind of constructing that area out. And then, one thing I always want to separate here that's challenging is the rib cage from the shoulders. So rib cage ends here, but we have that transition of plane that goes from, it looks like it gets more light at the top. And I would say that's the plane of the shoulders. So that would be the scapula to the acromion and then the muscles that are going to land there. So just do your best to always try to separate out these as two perspective units. And then for the arm, now we're just kind of into foreshortening cylinders. So that comes back to here. So kind of doing all my same checks with the cylinders. What would be the A or B? Am I under or above? Or if it's more comfortable for you, you can think, is it coming toward me or going away? And then the only other question is to what degree, how much? And you're controlling that with the ellipse. And if we do, the lower arm is going at a lesser angle. So I'm above it, but it's not as dramatic in the way that it moves away and then down. So I'm just trying to put this here so you could see both simultaneously. So that would be my perspective setup there. And then we've talked about the hand. So I think in this, I could see maybe like a plane change cross. So we could, if you want, you could try putting that little deck of cards at the end of the forearm. And then I'll just keep the fingers for now, kind of gestural. You have your landmarks on the elbow here, so we could put our ulna. This would be the funny bone in the lateral epicondyle. So now let's put in some legs. So the way where I look to start the leg is always about 2/3 of the way down. So I'm just going to guess that off the side. Maybe add a little ball. That would be the head of the great trochanter. And then let's double check my length. Well, I think I probably could make some corrections here. My gesture is a little bit more toward the horizontal. So here, this, and then whenever I start an ellipse, I always just put it overlapping the last form. Even if it's just by a little, I think it makes a difference so that your forms don't feel too disconnected. There. So there's that would be a representative volume for our femur. I always kind of build from the cylinder and then maybe plane the knee at the end. And then you can always use that. So I have to make an adjustment for my lower leg here. I'm just going to leave that so you can see. And then sometimes for construction, I'll just gesture down off the front of that knee, like we mentioned before, and then build a width. And this could be the wrapping line suggesting this leg going away. That's the ankle. And then we have the foot and this cool shape behind that. And so now I'm just kind of thinking of how to gesture that sock shape we talked about. So it looks like this figure would maybe be on a plane that's going just slightly away. I don't usually do a lot of this, but if it helps sometimes, there's nothing wrong with it. I probably could do it more. I just don't always think to do it. But it can help, like, for example, in this one, it might be useful for me to use it because I could take the line of where the pelvis is in space and say, oh, well, I probably need to bring this leg up a bit. And that might have gotten too long because what I'm seeing in the foreshortening is that there's the toe kind of ending back behind that pelvis more. So in this, what you can kind of see maybe even is the way that gesture and then the construction stage work with one another as a way of further trying to build correction or slowly get closer to your pose at every stage, right? By allowing for that correction. Because like, look at the beginning of my gesture and now where we are, which, could just mean I'm bad at this, but, I don't think that's the case. It just means that everybody has the same kind of challenges. It's a difficult practice, and that sometimes you get it, and then sometimes it takes a little extra work. This leg, I'm going to put the top of my cylinder here, and then let's follow that back and down. I'm trying to think of this going to the other side of that pelvis. So as I'm drawing this, I'm trying to reconcile with how it would be kind of starting over there. The reason that we have a little bit more negative space and where we could get a little bit nervous about proportion in some area is just that I'm separating these from what would be the basic silhouette that we're seeing due to the muscle and the fat, right? So something like that would be what I would build after this. So if it looks like, there's too much distance between the knee and or the femur and then the femur that's lower, or the femur, knee, and then the arm and scapula on her right side, that would be a result of maybe still needing to add muscle. Let's put this here. Another really cool S-curve to the top of that foot. And the way that you want to set that up is totally up to you. My thinking is always, I try to design these so that by the time I put the muscle on, it equals the contour. But like we said, when we played around with some of those more organic volumes for the drawing, you could play with that and change it for yourself, right? Because if I'm drawing the leg not as a box, but as that drumstick, that already takes into account some of the anatomy there. And then this arm is going away, so that goes this way. Okay, so that would be kind of basic idea for a seated pose there. Let's kind of go around here and try a few more. Let's try this one. Gesture. So again, notice the way that I'm moving. Foot would commonly be towards the back of the figure and gesture to the front to show that pinch. Make this way. Sure, for this knee. There's my arm. So I think that would be a fine gesture for something like this. And then we've been working with kind of the steps, but because this one starts to get more foreshortening, maybe instead of doing our step-by-step, we'll just kind of go more to the perspective forms. There we talked about in foreshortening how much more important or useful it could be to stack forms. Why don't we try that on this one just to do something a little different? So here we we'll work from each part to the next part. just in an effort to provide maybe a little bit different management of our process. So neck here, so I'm building immediately that overlap and how I see it. So maybe in an approach like this, I bring in a little bit more of an emphasis on the 2D instead of my kind of analytical. So here's the shape of the neck. That might end in here. And then let's put the mass of the rib cage behind that. And I see that coming out over here. Kind of leaning down and forward. So in this, again, just stacking and building one form in front, but connecting and modifying each form and its intersection so that they can hopefully belong. And then what we could also do in this one is let's put that separate structure for the shoulder on. So the shoulder is really doing something different than the rib cage. So by this one lifting, we've brought this whole plane up. So remember in my, I'll draw it over here just as a reminder that if we're just having the standing view, sometimes from the front, so I'm going to stand this up essentially, that it's more useful to try to think of the shoulders as this bridge, or we described it earlier as shoulder pads that a football player might wear, so that you can understand and try to implement a plane or a series of perspectives to help explain the shoulders a bit more. And this would be, if we connected it back to landmarks, pit of the neck, clavicle, which could come up a little bit higher, acromion, and then scapula. So those three give you that top plane. And then I just drop the width and the depth to make that connection to the rib cage. But what we want to remember, keep in mind, is that the arms don't have to do the same thing side to side. So in this, and we're definitely going to have two different positions. So on this side, I'm raising this shoulder. To probably bring it in some, but I'm just trying to make it clear so that you could see the whole of the form. So that would be our top. And later, this is where we could put if you go on to study anatomy or have an interest in that, this could be your trap. These planes down here are pretty good for just, when I'm starting out, getting the idea of which area the humerus is, because we can move the humerus, right, from those back, side, front. Here it's kind of on the corner. And then this one kind of comes forward more. So that one looks like it comes this way. I probably wouldn't use this, as I mentioned, just just as a reminder from the back, but from the front, I like to play around with it. It does make this area extra blocky, but I don't think that's a bad thing if your goal is to, again, understand what you're seeing and the forms and really emphasize that study of form. So that would be kind of splitting this in half. This one raised, this one came down. For the box of the rib cage, we wanted to do that. You could leave it in as an egg, of course, but let's do and I don't see it, let's say that this is where that thoracic opening is. Here's where that side plane of the box would be. I could see that over here, so it's getting some shadow. It's kind of in this area. And then for the pelvis, let's do our pelvis shape and then maybe build the connection afterwards. Just to show you in these that the process can be moved around. Like I gave that real strict 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think I've got that tilt off. Let me change that. But for your own approach, you can mix and match for whatever feels like it makes the most sense. So, that would have been an argument for me probably needing to do the tilt first. So I had that there in mind. I got a little lost when trying to just go without. So I just needed to back up, pay a little more attention. And then this would be maybe leaning forward like this. So there's There's my depth. Otherwise, doing the same thing here, kind of guessing where those landmarks would be, even though I'm having trouble seeing them because of the raised leg, and then using those to get my height, width, and depth. So starting with the ball and then carving it. Right, just so we don't forget the relationship of those steps. Remember, to show the perspective isn't to make a different form, it's to refine the existing ball or egg. Then this is all stretched. So that would be our stretched. And then we'd have a bit of compression in here, even though I'm not really seeing that because, again, of the leg. And then here, let's put in our perspective. So we have our knee all the way up here. I'm going to start that with a box. So this is kind of, again, going back to our emphasis here on placing shape to foreshorten it, and then once having it set up, advancing the perspective around it. So this is my shape. And then just so I don't drive you crazy, let's just bring some of this back so you don't have to see it or deal with it. So that would be my femur. And then maybe I'll just drop that plane down, which would be the knee. And you can see on this one how I kind of go from sharper to a little bit more curved at the bottom. So that would be kind of attempting a bit more of an organic form earlier. And then remember how useful it can be if you have this plane of the knee, that you can take these corners and just use that as your gestural start for the front of the lower leg. So that gives me the width of my lower leg, and then I could just turn this corner and decide how much depth I want to add. So again, let me move some of this out of the way. So this corner, see your S curve down. Is really beautiful. This model does really beautiful things. This is from Bodies in Motion again, .photo. No, I don't get any money if you subscribe to it. I just really like it. It's my favorite kind of site to draw from. It's not an advertisement. And then foot. Where's the touching the ground plane? And you could even bring this down to the foot if you wanted, so that front plane could build that ramp in for the foot there. And then from the other side, we get our leg. Hard to know where it starts, but it would be coming from here. So that's my leg. I'm going to make that ellipse really narrow because I think I'm kind of like, I'm more next to that than I am above or below it. So that'd be my upper leg. And then from there, we could create a lower leg, kind of thinking the same way as we did on the initial leg. And then this creates another really fun rhythm that almost covers the pelvis there. Let's do the arms. So in this one, so when I have this shoulder structure, sometimes what I like to do is see if I can match or stand the humerus on a specific plane. So this humerus would kind of be at that corner, this corner between front and side. The reason I would do something like that is it does end up for me being really helpful with muscles, how to integrate the muscles of the shoulder to the humerus. It's also not a bad idea if you plan to move towards anatomy that you take your cylinders for the arms one step further and plane them. And the reason for that is because muscles of the arms are really specific. So you're always going to get a muscle on the front, inside, outside, or back. And they don't really confuse, right? They don't sometimes go somewhere else or blend surfaces. So if you can see that, you can also see the way the arm rotates, which I think is one of the most challenging aspects of finding the anatomy. And then this would be more foreshortened. So let's use a different volume here, because that form kind of suggests more of that egg to 2x4. So I'm going to do my fuller form, 2x4 at the end. So again, what is that? It's just practicing drawing an egg and then shoving a box into it. Not to, take away the romance of this, but that's all I'm doing. And then when we're building anatomy or building tone on this, the goal is just to maintain this, but hide it so that we keep the illusion, right? The perspective illusion of what's happening here, but show it artfully with a hidden usage, or use the tone to state it while hiding it. And then the hand would be built off the end there. So that would be the finish to that form. And then for this one, well, this one's really foreshortened, so maybe I'll move it up here. So let's get rid of some of this, just so it helps you to see a little more clearly. And then I say it barely matches with the pelvis at the bottom. So I'm getting something like this. Here's my parallel lines to connect beginning and end. And then we have our landmarks. So ulna, funny bone. And then this kind of has that really nice flow into the gesture of the leg. I always like that when you can find how one body part just kind of flows into the next. Not in an anatomical sense here, more in kind of a design and posed sense. So that's going that way, and then it would be moving into the hand. So just erasing back the areas of my developed drawing so that they don't compete in this. I want you to be able to see all the work, but then not be too confused at the end. So this would be that gestured deck of cards for the hand, and then I'd probably just blend the gesture of the fingers into the shape of the cap. So that would be kind of a seated / foreshortened pose there. Let's try something like this. There's my kind of progression of gesture lines. Big pinch here from rib cage to pelvis. Big stretch on the front. Good. So in these, I'm just trying to show you a seated pose again from every angle. And then my tilt. So let's do our tilts. I think this is a little higher. So I'll go with something like that. Rib cage is clearly tilting this way. And then I could use that as reference for my shapes. So rib cage shape. The reason I was mixing up the steps a little bit on the last one is I just don't want you to feel like these have to be done one way, right? You can have your own approach, and you can emphasize your own concerns and how you want something to look just by playing around with their sequence, or like having a creative relationship to it. Now I'm doing my transitions or my connections. I'm looking for those pinches and stretches and those overlaps and wraps. All those things you're probably tired of hearing about now. Same thing on this side. Stretch. So that gives me that S-curve, so it feels in my line economy that it maybe has a different look or quality than the pinching. And then on this side, we'll do our pinch. See how that line comes in? And now our pelvis is pretty high here. Now, next step would be my landmarks. So where's my center line? Pit of the neck, through belly button, back down to center of pelvis. So that tells me I have a 3/4 orientation. And let's put in our arms. Clavicle. You could see that top plane again, like we did on the one above. If you don't want to do the whole bridge, sometimes I'll just draw scapula, acromion, clavicle, and that could be good enough, depending on where your comfort is. I use the one that we did above, like the football player shoulder pads, just to really, really push it so I can clearly understand what's happening. But if you're feeling pretty confident with the pose and how the shoulders are working, then you can tone it back like I've done here. Also, an alternative to showing the rib cage as a box is if we go back to our proportion lecture, a couple inches off the manubrium or that sternum, you can create a curving gesture line from this point to the 10th rib, and that'll give you a organic plane change for your rib cage egg. So it's not with the clarity of the box, like how the front side work, but it gives you the same nonetheless. So we could say that's where the ribs would kind of turn from front to back there. And then my as-is points would be here for the pelvis. That's my front. And you can see look how many times I tried that line. This is just loosely trying to sketch. So, ghost it, try it a few times, but that's just me drawing a straight from our, first talk or that first exercise on just what are the mechanics of line that I'm using. Straight, ghost it, plot it, and then try to match it. So always the same. So that's what I mean. Like, this can be a figure, but it could also be an animal, could also be a car. What matters most is that you're building comfort with the language of drawing so that you can have the greatest variety of subject from your imagination. So for the upper arm, let's see, humerus going this way. Remember, for the most part, the humerus is going to be the length of the 10th rib, but this is foreshortened. So I can always use that as what's expected and then pull up or down depending on the degree arm is foreshortened. I can use it as a reference point is what I mean. And then the forearm goes this way, goes back. So above we use the ball with the 2x4 in it. Here I'm just going to use a cylinder. And then put on that glove for the hand. On this side, nice, really beautiful kind of diagonal gesture for this arm out. There's the forearm. Maybe a little long, so I could just carve that back up. Now, what's happening with our limbs? Well, I think this is going away. So let's say I'm going to start. Let's find what would be the direction of the bone here. Maybe like this. So on top of that, I could build my ellipse and just make sure it has some overlapping quality with that pelvis. There's the bottom, and then just try to connect these back up. And then maybe this one goes away a bit more. I'm noticing that wrist bisects it or crosses it about the halfway point. And I do find myself defaulting to kind of this bowling pin shape for the lower leg quite a bit, or it could be another drumstick shape too. Ran out of room for the foot, but let's do this front leg. Same thing. Where is it starting? Here. Maybe we could do this one with a plane, try to see it more as a box instead of the cylinder for showing options. So there's line got a little too wavy. I need to work on my straights. Maybe ghost that a few more times. So now that could give me my front and my bottom, and then we could, create we do the lower leg instead of building like we've done many times from these bottom 2 points. I could draw it as its own volume and stack it in front. So let's go back to that bowling pin shape. So that gives us the fullness of the calf and then the tapering width of the ankle. But I do eventually want to come back and try to match it to that plane of the knee. And then let's just gesture on that flowy or sock-based shape of the foot here. And one last one here. Let's try something like this. Good lines. What could be challenging and fun about doing poses like this is when you draw a ton of standing figures, you're going to get used to your perspective volumes being in a specific orientation. So like drawing that drumstick of the leg up, or doing something that you're not accustomed to is challenging. Right? But so it's going to force you back into the habit of reassessing, like I've been doing. How am I drawing straight lines? How does that line look? What's going on with that box? Those kinds of things, which I think is good. So here's my scapula. See, so that's very much raised. And then you're going to run into this other guy up here, but there'll be my humerus, forearm. And then on this side here, we have our scapula really pushing back against the spine. And I realized some of the information here that could be confusing, like all the pinching on the back and what's happening as this arm raises. All of that would be more related to anatomy. And so I'm trying to keep it separate here for the most part so that you just appreciate what we're doing as far as the build-up for the construction as its own stage. But you would then have to use this stage, right, once you're comfortable with it, to start stacking on those minor anatomical forms and then giving them each gestures for how they work and relate. Which is a lot of fun, as long as this is good. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest issue I always see students have is if people are really good at picking up anatomy quickly. That's teaching 20 years, that's my experience. But what happens is they experience a lot of frustration because they'll go right to that drawing of a muscle shape, but it never has any underlying form to it. It doesn't sit on these. So the idea of a muscle will be the same thing as everything we've been developing here. A muscle will have to just become a form intersection, like, just like what we're doing with the stretch and the pinch, or the combination of volumes. So stretch and pinch, making sure that kind of shows a minor or some relationship to what's there. There's a big turn for the lumbar area of the spine. And then we could box it. So here's some landmarks. That gives me my width. Here's my height. And then this is my depth. Same thing here. Floating rib, floating rib. Depth. And then, scapula I've already kind of placed. So then thinking of this corner, I could develop my humerus. The other thing I usually don't do is curve, so I'm showing this with more of a curve just to make the point. I usually don't curve my volumes. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but the reason I don't curve it is because the curve is suggesting a contour, but I don't want this to be contour yet. I want contour to come as a result of the muscle that I put on top. This is just supposed to be slightly larger bone so that I can put those muscle forms on top. If I'm building out muscle forms and each one has its own curve and I'm planning that to be the contour, I think it's possible that having your underlying volumes curved too much will work to your disadvantage at the stage of muscle. And then this leg, so it's overlap it to that bottom third, goes this way. And then I'm going to shorten it a bit just to emphasize the foreshortening. That's the bottom and then the inside. And then let's move this up. S-curve versus a straight for my bowling pin shape, and that gives me the hard versus soft of that form. Here's the heel, and then I like how this kind of just leads your eye into the arm. And then this one, leg starts here, and then we see the inside and the top. So hopefully what this shows you is that there is no real difference in the mechanics of how I'm thinking to get a perspective pose. Like, even though there can be little tricks here and there to make your life easier when you're drawing a seated versus a standing, there's really no fundamental difference. You're just organizing volumes, right, to be suggestive of the pose. And so at that point, it's just eggs, boxes, form intersections, wrapping lines, etc. But hopefully this gives you, again, a bit of a turnaround, right, to show a back, a front 3/4, and a back 3/4 with weight being on the pelvis or bottom of the pelvis.